my house in Kinross. I'm in the kitchen today. My name's Nicola and I'm here to do a couple of reminiscence films for you today from my kitchen, talking all about kitchens and how maybe they've changed over your lifetime, and food, glorious food, trying to remember some of the wonderful food and maybe not so wonderful food that you've had in the past. And then we'll talk a little bit about meal times as well and what you can remember of those. So I hope as we go through, it'll jog some memories for you about kitchens that you've lived in the past. So let's start by going back in time, and I don't know if you remember perhaps the kitchen that you first lived in. It might look quite different to this. Perhaps you lived in the countryside and you had a range cooker that had to be lit every morning and cleaned with something like this. I'm very glad I don't have to have this in my cupboard anymore. This is Zebo Black Great Polish. Perhaps your mum or your grandmother got busy with this on their range cooker. It looks like you need a lot of elbow grease to get that working. But you also might be familiar with some of the objects I've got here as well. There's a pair of very ornate bellows I've got. Perhaps these were used to light the fire in the morning. And I've also got this object here, which of course is very familiar to us today, this kettle. It's very heavy because it's made out of cast iron. The one I have today, which I can just plug in and switch a switch on to work, is made out of plastic and metal. But this one probably sat on your range every day of the week, every day of the year, and may have heated your hot water for your baths, as well as make your cup of tea in the morning. And of course, this handle would have got very hot as well. So everything's changed and become much more safety conscious. But I'm just amazed by how heavy that is when I pick it up. And probably needed quite a bit of cleaning as well. I've also got this here, which is a very sort of iconic Scottish object, I would say. This griddle, or girdle as I think maybe sometimes it's called in Scotland. It's a lovely, lovely object, and of course, and hopefully you remember having the results of it for your breakfast, maybe dropped scones, Scotch pancakes, cooked on there in front of the fire. That must be a really nice memory if it happened to you. So that would have sat by the fire as well. Again, it's pretty heavy as well. I think people needed a lot more muscle to work in kitchens many years ago. Now, of course, my cooker here is very, very simple. I can just turn it on with a touch of a button, and everything's very easy to clean as well, and all my saucepans are very light in comparison to those. And I've got two ovens here as well. But also in my kitchen, I think the two things that I couldn't do without anymore are a fridge and a freezer. Now mine are hidden away behind my fitted units, but fridges, you might remember the first kitchen you grew up in not having a fridge at all, because fridges really became popular in the 1950s, 1960s. Perhaps you remember getting your first fridge and being able to change the way that you shopped every day and kept things cool as well. It must have been, you must have had to use quite a lot of imagination to keep your butter and your meat from going off when you had it during the summer. Even though houses maybe were a bit cooler because we didn't have central heating, it must have been challenging sometimes on those hot days, which you occasionally get in Scotland. And the freezer as well. I'm sure you remember not having a freezer because they really only became popular in the 1970s. But I couldn't do that. I've really enjoyed having a freezer this past year. I've kept lots of extra food that we've cooked, leftovers, but fish fingers for the kids, frozen chips, ice cream, that sort of thing. So that's been really, really invaluable. So the sort of things that have changed in kitchens over time. Now you may well remember getting your first gas cooker as well, or a fitted kitchen. This is a lovely advert for the Perth Corporation Gas Department selling first cookers, and this lady looks very happy with her first gas cooker. Much cleaner to cook on, much easier to keep clean. But yeah, quite a lot of people have gas cookers these days. We've got all electric here, but another little improvement in the way that you could spend your time in the kitchen. The other thing I've got here are some gadgets, because of course a lot of people like to have all sorts of gadgets in their kitchen today, and for me this little gadget, this little hand whisk, really tells me about how power has changed in the kitchen. How when you were growing up, probably the only thing you use electricity for in your kitchen might have been the lights. Whereas today I've got an electric kettle, I've got an electric toaster, I've got electric ovens, I've got electric mixer, all sorts of things, but all you had for power was your muscles. So your hand whisk, and I can't imagine how long this took to whisk up your eggs to make meringues or your cake mix. It takes me a couple of minutes to do it with an electric mixer. But I reckon this must have been quite a to do. And when you have to make everything from scratch, that's quite a big effort. The last object I'm going to show you is something that I'm sure you'll recognise, and it was a very popular little gadget to have in your kitchen. Often once you had your roast on the Sunday, you might want to make your leftovers. So this object here, I'm sure you recognise, is a mincer. We put it on the side of a worktop, and I can remember my mum having a mincing attachment for her Kenwood, and I can remember loving to put the chunks of meat down the hole here and turning it, and all the little worms of mince would come out from here, and then she would make it into meatballs or something like that for our next meal. But mince and tatties started here, so that is probably a very familiar object. Again, pretty heavy, so there's no plastic here, all just metal. So those are a few objects and a few items to think about when you think about your kitchen. Have a little discussion about the kitchens that you used to remember when you were growing up, and maybe think about how they changed over time as well. So next we're going to go and talk on about food. Welcome back to my kitchen in Kinross. Now we're going to think about food, and unfortunately I can't give you the smells, but hopefully you can imagine the kind of food you used to have as a child. Now I know that my children will remember the puddings that we produce more than anything. My son's favourite is a crumble. My daughter loves a jelly. I wonder if you ever had a jelly from a jelly mould of this kind of shape. Now these go back a long way, but these very light aluminium jellies, I've seen them in a cookbook like this in the 1970s as party food. So possibly you might have had a jelly from this kind of shape. But also I've got a pudding bowl here. Now I wonder what kind of lovely delicious steamed puddings, or maybe a savoury pudding you had wrapped in pastry, came out of these kind of bowls. And I remember my mum had a selection of these different shaped, different size bowls. So hopefully you'll remember lovely memories from those containers. I've also got, very Scottish here, a shortbread mould here. And I wonder when you produced shortbread, whether it was just for your first footing at New Year possibly, or was it a run-of-the-mill, something you had when visitors came around, or was it more of an everyday treat? Interesting to know. So let's go back to the 1940s, because food and our opportunities to get food were very different in the 1940s, of course, because we had rationing. And it's amazing to think that rationing lasted 14 years. So I can imagine if you were cooking at that time, or the people who were cooking for you must have had to use their imagination a huge amount to find imaginative ways to make food interesting and varied for you. But it's interesting to look at the kind of foods that were around, the kind of foods that were rationed at that point. I've only got one little egg here because, of course, dried egg powder was very popular as well. I hear that it wasn't very nice, but I'm sure you'll remember whether it was or not. Various types of different fats as well. I've got some margarine here. Margarine is something I don't often cook with myself, but I know that was popular for making cakes and for cooking with, and maybe it didn't need to be refrigerated quite as much as butter, or was easier to use when it wasn't in the fridge. And I've also got dripping. Now dripping is something I've never really cooked with, but I remember my mum collecting the dripping from the Sunday roast. It's something that possibly we can't do anymore because roasts are often meat's quite lean these days, but dripping and cooking with fat as well was very, very popular in the 1940s and probably made everything taste really amazing. So I'm actually looking forward to cooking my roast potatoes with this to see what it tastes like. Cheese and bacon. I think bacon was very popular, and lots of different ways to trying to make your bacon stretch and bring out the flavour, because of course that beautiful salty flavour, try and eke it out into lots of different foods as well. And your cheese, not a lot of sugar to go around, maybe some baking to be done, not a lot of sugar, and of course no sweeties, so my children would have suffered for that as well. But of course we haven't got the fruit and vegetables here. Maybe if you lived in the countryside, you grew your own fruit and vegetables, or what fruit you could, but certainly your vegetables. And of course everyone was encouraged to dig for victory and dig up their gardens and put vegetables in. So perhaps you remember doing that and being part of that as a family. Of course, help was at hand, and I've got this fun book here, well, it's fun now, maybe not at the time, Eating for Victory. This is full of all the leaflets that came out from the Ministry of Food, which contains lots of advice about how to make your rationed food last a bit longer. And it's really interesting reading it, because unlike books today with advice, today it's a lot about diet and a lot about trying to not eat too much food, but here it's about trying to stretch it as far as possible. So we've got making the most of the fat ration, how to make dripping spreads. Now I reckon bread and dripping must have been quite an amazing flavour, but not looked down on today to eat. But also concern about nutrition as well. We've got bodybuilding foods as well, trying to give people some education about what to eat and how much to eat of it. So that's really interesting as well. Now moving on from the 1940s, of course, we then got into the 1950s and 1960s, and the world started opening up. Lots of influences of lots of brands came in from America, and now my cupboards are full of crisps and biscuits from all sorts of different brands, colourful brands that you pick up from the new supermarkets, of course. And cooking, it'd be really interesting to know, so there's lots more variety, but really interesting to know where you got your recipes from. Because today I can turn on the television and most of the time there's a TV programme on about cooking, lots of ideas, lots of different influences from lots of different countries. But really, in the 1940s, 1930s, 40s, this was pretty much your chunky book of cooking recipes. But perhaps I wonder whether most of your ideas came from your own family and whether recipes really were passed down within families. I've got a cookbook here, which is from the 1970s, I think. And this is by a very famous chef, one of the first TV chefs really, Marguerite Patten, who was also working for the Ministry of Food and gave lots of advice to people about rationed food. She went on to do lots of cookery TV programs, but originally started on the radio and cooked and gave us lots of advice on how to cook. The other thing that's changed as well is the influence of other countries' foods. And I've just got one example here, which is the food of Italy, which I think if I asked my children, they would think of as everyday food. We have pasta several times a week, and my choice of cooking oil is olive oil, which probably in the 1940s you would have just found in a pharmacy. Elizabeth David, this little book here, Elizabeth David was one of the first people who went to Italy and tried to encourage us Brits to eat Italian food and to enjoy pizza and pasta. So I wonder if you remember having your first taste of a slice of pizza, or your first attempt to pick up spaghetti from the plate and twist it onto your fork. And then whether you went on to try lots of different other cultures of food, like Indian food or Chinese food, which became popular in the 1980s. I remember Ken Home. So lots of different. So there's an opportunity there to think about how your tastes in food maybe changed over time from where we got to from the 1940s up to the present day. And I hope it gives you lots of memories of lovely, delicious foods you had along the way. Welcome to my dining area in my kitchen now. This table is used for everything. We eat here, we do craft here, we do all sorts of things here. So this is our dining room, our entertaining space, as well as our everyday eating space. So I've just laid out a few little different areas here. First, we've got breakfast. Now, breakfast for us these days is quite an informal affair. The children come and go and we have what we like. But I know that my parents always lay out the night before their bowl and their cup of tea and their toast rack and their butter dish, so they're ready to go in the morning. And we've got a nice tea caddy here as well. Don't know if tea was your thing. And a milk bottle for your milk delivery in the morning. That used to be a very, very common thing, although we don't get a milk delivery here anymore. So I wonder what you had for breakfast in the morning, whether it was toast, whether it was bacon and eggs, whether it was porridge in your bowl, in your willow bowl. And then how about lunch and dinner? For some people, lunch was the main meal of the day. I remember when I went to stay with my granny, lunch was always the main meal of the day, and we'd have a piece of meat, and we'd always have boiled potatoes. There's always boiled potatoes and veg, and they're always eaten on plates just like this one. This design seems to be very, very popular, very common across the UK, so I wonder if you remember that. And so we always have lunch, and then we would have a sort of high tea at sort of 5:30. So we'd have something hot on our plates, and then we'd have cake and biscuits, which as a child I used to love. But perhaps you had a different routine. Perhaps you had lunch. Nowadays we have lunches, sandwiches and things like that, salad, and then have our main meal in the evening. And I wonder whether sitting around the table as a child, whether you can remember particular manners that you had to follow, whether there are particular rituals that you had to follow. I'm very keen on getting everyone to sit round the kitchen table, although now there's lots and lots of distractions from the TV to be able to sit in front of the TV. But it's really nice to be able to sit round the table, even if the kids are keen to get away. But I wonder what kind of rules you had when you were growing up about sitting around the table and eating together, sharing meals. And then let's think about entertaining as well. I wonder whether you were a great host, whether you had people round and shared food with them for dinner parties or parties. I've got also a few little commemorative items here, because of course in the 1970s there were great street parties out on the streets for the Silver Jubilee. I've even got a little t-shirt here, which is maybe the sort of thing that a child of yours may have worn. And I've got some commemorative jugs, or a little glass there, and a plate for the Queen's Jubilee, which seems a long time ago now, but marked the 25th anniversary of her reign. And a lovely 1970s tray, which you may have used to carry drinks around when you had people around. And of course we didn't always eat at home. Maybe picnics were your thing, taking things out for picnics. I've got a very smart Tupperware container here. Looks more like something you'd have at a party really. But Tupperware of course meant that you could keep things and store things and take them out for picnics and parties as well. So that's a little think about meal times and the routines you might have had for meal times. Thank you very much for watching all these films. I hope it's jogged your memory, and I hope that you can share those memories with those around about you.